Hey everybody, welcome back. I hope you're all having a great day. I'm back at Madison, back at school for the start of the semester. I'm going to do a video pretty soon on kind of everything I'm reading this semester, so what you all can expect me to discuss for the most part, although I am going to try to be squeezing some other stuff in. This video is kind of everything I've been reading for the last couple weeks. I'm going to break into two videos. This first one is going to include some short stories, so Frank O'Connor, Guy de Maupassant. I'm also going to talk about Turbulence by David Szalay, which was an incredible book. This is a novel, but kind of in short stories. And then also Zone Rouge, which I'm just finishing up. I'm going to film the second part of this video with these novels later today. And this is by Jerome Plunkett, and it comes out from Unnamed Press September 2nd. But yeah, I want to start with some of these kind of short stories. I think both these writers are really interesting, and they're writers that I've kind of fallen in love with over the past month or so. I've been reading a ton of Frank O'Connor. Actually, let me grab... So when I was in Ireland, like 3 or 4 months ago, I picked up Guests to the Nation by Frank O'Connor. This was a crazy old copy, just completely withered. And Guests to the Nation is his first ever collection, and it comes from his experience during, I believe, the Irish Civil War. And Guests to the Nation is a story that is in this small collection of kind of his best stories, which is part of the new Penguin Archive series. I got a couple of these: Frank O'Connor, Clarice Lispector, Catherine Mansfield, George Orwell, and they've all been really interesting. But I've read 5 out of the 6 stories in here, I believe. First Confession, The Genius, My Oedipus Complex, a story by Maupassant, which is really interesting and kind of why I want to discuss these two people together, because one kind of comes up in another story. But yeah, and then I got this in Chicago, Domestic Relations, which I think was his final. So first and final collections while alive. And then I even I hunted down this novel of his, which is impossible to find, Dutch Interior. So I've become absolutely fascinated by Frank O'Connor. He's just an incredible writer. His language is so precise, and his stories all have this sort of quality to them that's not just in the writing, but also the plot and in sort of what he leaves out. I don't know. He's brilliant and super underappreciated. I can't believe I haven't read him earlier than I did. But yeah, so I would just want to talk a little bit about these stories. Again, he's pretty heavily out of print in terms of the books he was actually publishing in his lifetime. There's sort of, collected stories you can get. This is probably the most accessible thing in terms of just 6 short stories. And the first, Guest to the Nation, is the one I read a while ago. But it's about a few Irishmen who are keeping men from the British Army captive, because men from the British Army are keeping Irish men captive. And so it's like, well, if they kill our men, we have to kill their men. And the men sort of at the front lines, or the one specific character that's really being focused on as the sort of narrator, is sort of unaware of what's going on. He doesn't really understand the total dynamics of this, and they've sort of become best friends in a way. And so it's obviously leading up to a sort of resolution that is just brilliantly done. The word chum, we're chums, aren't we, comes up a million times. So I kind of love that, like, old or perhaps just like culturally different language. And that is literally one of the best stories I have ever read. All of these are brilliant, but Guests of the Nation is one that's just, it's just one of those perfect stories where every word is used properly. The tension is so thick, and I don't want to say too much else about it, but I think it's a lot of his stories have a ton of humor, especially something like My Oedipus Complex, where it's sort of this boy who just hates his dad because of the attention he gets when he comes back from the war from his mother, and is sort of like, well, it's either me or him in this household, he's getting all, and so that's pretty funny. The Genius is also this young boy who feels as though he's a genius, and he's directly narrating, but through his direct narration you start to feel sympathy for basically everyone else besides this, 3rd grade boy, who it's pretty hard to like not like a 3rd grade boy or to like laugh at him every step of the way, but he kind of does that. It's like this kid is so far from, he might actually be sort of smart, like he's reading at a young age and doing all this stuff, but he's a moron. And so that's very funny. And there's humor through all the stories, but it's a very serious, very sort of dark story, and I like the way he engages in war in kind of all the stories, including My Oedipus Complex. But Guest to the Nation is obviously, it's his most well-known, and it's just brilliant. I would totally recommend reading that. 15 pages, it'll be worth it, whether or not you decide to read his books or full collections or whatever else. He works really well in the short story form, and actually I've been getting into a lot of these random anthologies. This one is called The Story and Its Writer. And it's sort of like, 50 stories by 50 different writers, and then commentary from those writers on their writing process, commentary from other writers on the writing of others, and it's just a sort of fascinating, it's like going down a rabbit hole online, sort of, but in physical form, and it really holds your attention in a brilliant way, and you can really get a good understanding of a lot of different people. It was actually my introduction to Maupassant, and yeah, but anyway, you kind of see how O'Connor looks at the short story form, and it's sort of a way for what he calls like his literature, provincial literature, writing about a specific class of people, similar to the way Nelson Algren does in kind of the stuff I've been talking about there. I see a ton of connections, including them both being blacklisted by their governments for writing about poverty and criminality and their views on the church and different things like that. So that's all very fascinating. And again, I say all that to say that like Uprooted, which is one that like in the middle of it, I was like, I think this is going on too long. I've kind of lost the plot. Maybe it's, 20 pages instead of 10 or whatever. But the way it ends actually made me go back and reread the whole thing. And then I was like, this is brilliant. And so I don't know. I haven't read anything of his that I don't love. That was the closest I came to being like, what's going on here? And then it ended up being like one of my favorites, probably behind Guests of a Nation. That one's really interesting. And that one's about people who have left either the countryside or smaller towns, smaller cities like where he's from, Cork, to go to Dublin and have kind of been like, are kind of coming back home to visit and seeing the life they could have had, and the way they come to the decision that, they've made their choice and they can't go back on it no matter how much they wish they could, is really fascinating. And it's just a heart-wrenching ending. First Confession is brilliant. It really shows the hypocrisy of the Catholic Church at the time, which was something he was super interested in Ireland, and obviously was kind of right on the nose with a lot of the stuff he was talking about. I don't think even he quite understood like where it was going to lead with stuff like the Magdalene laundries and et cetera, but he was, a great critic, obviously led to a lot of issues in terms of publishing his books, getting them reprinted, things like that. But My First Confession was very funny. Again, working with a really small child who is kind of coming to an understanding of the church. But it's actually like he's sort of going about religion the right way. Even the priest sort of acknowledges that. And like everyone around him is kind of fueling their worship with hate. And it's just, that's very interesting. And lastly, I just want to say a story by Maupassant is kind of about two characters who are best friends in boyhood and then kind of drift apart and kind of come back together when one of them is struggling quite a bit and unwilling to recognize it. And it really takes, it's fascinating because I actually really love when people directly put literature inside their stories and novels and all that stuff. A lot of people say like there's too many novels about writers, too many whatever, and that's probably true, but there's too few novels that actually interact with the ideas of specific novels and specific writers, et cetera, et cetera. And so the way he takes one person who appreciates Guy de Maupassant and one person who hates his writing, says it's not poetry, it's not whatever. I forget the example he uses, something like, Keats, which is hilarious. So this guy's an academic, he likes Keats, he likes the Russians because at least they're noble. Whatever you say about the Russians, they're noble. Noble was a great word of his at the time. Shakespeare was noble. Turgenev was noble. Beethoven was noble. They are religious people, like the Greeks or the English of Shakespeare's time. But Maupassant is slick and coarse and commonplace. Are his stories literature? To hell with literature, I said. It's life. So that's kind of the point that I think he's making. And so sort of the person who is kind of against Maupassant because it's not real literature kind of gets involved in the sort of story that would take place in a Maupassant novel, and perhaps he would have understood life well enough to kind of keep himself out of a certain situation, or at least navigate it in a better fashion. And if he actually understood life on the level that a Maupassant story does, it's sort of brilliant the way he works this. And I love the story. It's sort of like to say it's like, it's his best is probably wrong. Still, like Guest of a Nation was like just top of the line. But I think the sort of interaction between, reading Maupassant stories and Frank O'Connor and sort of the introduction about Maupassant, and then, Maupassant is a story in here, and then Kate Chopin talks about why, or was it Chopin? I forget who it was, who talks about why she likes Maupassant and sort of this idea of literature versus simply writing about real life. And then you can read about Frank O'Connor here. And actually, one of the most interesting things is the story in here by Maupassant is called The Necklace, which is sort of his most famous story. And it actually, while very much sort of criticizing the French bourgeois or whatever, it's actually kind of farther than a lot of other stories, I feel like, from the heart of his viewpoint on things. And I think it's really interesting because it has a sort of gimmicky ending in a way, where the whole thing flips on its head. That story is about a woman who feels like she should have been born rich or should have been able to marry rich because of how pretty she is. And so she spends all her time feeling sad for herself, being like, I should have this house, I should have this dress, I should have this, that, whatever. And her husband kind of notices, and so he works his ass off to get this invite to a ball. And instead of being happy, she's just crying because she doesn't have the right dress or the right necklace. And so he spends the money he's saving to go hunting on her dress, and then he says, borrow this necklace from your rich friend, and she does. And then, maybe she loses the necklace and things go sort of out of control, and you see the value of something to a family like theirs versus to the rich lady who had the necklace. And it's sort of fascinating, and the whole thing sort of flips on its head, and it jumps 10 years in an instant. And that's what I mean by kind of gimmicky, but it's also a brilliant story, and obviously that's probably the easiest to find, most accessible. But yeah, I think that he's very fascinated with Parisian life, with sort of the closest relationships you can have. And obviously there's a lot of affairs in his writing. But I mean, he's so, again, it feels like a sort of lineage from Maupassant to O'Connor to someone like Algren. And I don't know. I just think that that stuff is really interesting. And I've been enjoying this a lot. I'll tell you which ones I read. I'm very excited to read, but haven't read, Mother of Invention. I've read some criticism that mentioned that, but I have read The Necklace, obviously. Train Story, A Woman's Confession. Bolle de Suif is considered his sort of masterpiece, I think. But it's a bit longer. I haven't read that yet. Anyway, this is a book I'm going to probably stick with for a while and just sort of come back to. Because his stuff is just it's really invigorating to read. It's the exact same feeling as O'Connor, although O'Connor is quickly becoming one of my literal favorite writers. I mean, I really am going to read so much of his stuff, especially during the school year and when I have the time, winter break, whatever. But I just wanted to touch on these quickly and say that if you have, listened to me talk about Algren and you're into him, these are definitely two older writers to check out. Obviously, Maupassant is much older, but these are both great books, probably the most easy to find, accessible versions of any of their stuff. I have this novel, Pierre and Jean, I think, that I'm going to read soon from him and see how he handles sort of longer stuff. I also have some Szalay, so I'm kind of getting into, both Irish and French. But yeah, just wanted to throw some stuff out there. I think it's always awesome to have a good short story collection by your bedside or whatever. And I don't know, another great one I'm reading right now is Young Skins by Colin Barrett, mentioned his name, and Letters to a Young Writer by Colin McCann. This is sort of it's really interesting. I don't tend to read a lot of sort of nonfiction advice to writers, but I do have a couple books that I've been recommended by, because it's hard to sort through that stuff. You never know what's good and what's not. This was just a gift, and there's other sort of ones I've been recommended that I've purchased. John Gardner, Jerome Stern. Maybe I'll make a video on some of that stuff. And yeah, so I'll be back soon to talk about Turbulence. Incredible book, and Zone Rouge. And then like some of the other stuff I'm reading right now, I'm going to do a sort of a part 2 video, like I said. Karate Chop, stories by Dorothy Norse. I have the Ferrante book. I'm not sure where that is, but I'm almost done with that. And then Boathouse, which I finished. And so this is all kind of what to expect in the next week or so. And I'll be back in just a minute to talk about these 2 books. Thanks for watching so far. Hey everybody, it took me an extra day to finish Zone Rouge by Michael Jerome Plunkett. But this book was fantastic, and I really can't wait to talk about it. I'm going to start out with Turbulence by David Szalay because it's fading from my memory already. It's been like a week and a half, 2 weeks since I finished this book. And it might be the fastest I've ever read a book, like regardless of page length. Fox was pretty close because I was reading Fox really, really fast. I mean, 650 pages in like 2.5 weeks was really quick for me. But Turbulence I read in like a day and a half maybe. And this is 140 pages, but there's some like blank spots in the middle, so it's really quite short. And this was a book that was commissioned by the BBC for the airwaves, so it was kind of pitched to him, and then he sort of wrote these 12 interconnected short stories that would be read aloud in London. And so it's a really interesting concept because I don't know, I wonder about sort of the freedom of being able to write what you want versus not. And I don't even know if that plays in at all. But it's just interesting to think about writing a book that way. I mean, it's sort of a thing that they do every year, and they sort of pick out a big name writer. So I do think you have a lot of freedom, of course. But I don't know. It's just an interesting fact. I'm really excited to start his most recent book, Flesh, which was just nominated for the Booker. And this is supposed to be his most like novelty of anything. Pretty much most of his stuff, at least the stuff that's been big, like All That Man Is, have been somewhere between a short story collection and a novel. And this is no different. It basically takes place on planes, hence the title Turbulence. It's 12 people making basically a circle around the globe. Every chapter starts off with the name of flights, sort of like the airport to airport thing, like you can see right there. Everything's like that, where like the 3 abbreviation letters. And each story seeps into the last. It's not always who you'd expect from one story to pop up in the other. At one point, there's like a famous writer being interviewed, and then the next story sort of becomes about that writer's daughter, and then the writer meets this woman, but then that woman's mother is the person that the next thing is focused on, and she's having the affair with. So it's like, it's sort of twisty, but you do recognize it. Some of them are more straightforward than that. That was just sort of the most interesting example. And I guess the most important thing is just that this writing is addictive. He is so almost going against everything that I get taught now as a student, especially when it comes to like, dialogue can be brief and whatever, but it's never supposed to dialogue that sounds real to us when we're reading isn't how people actually talk in real life. I mean, he completely does away with that. And it's a thing that I kind of hold to be true when I'm reading. But here, I mean, every word is a yes or a okay or whatever. Like every single, I mean, you could Command F this book for that and it would be, astounding. And I don't know, I'm going to read a little portion because I want to spend most of the time talking about Zone Rouge. But this is a really wonderful book and a really short read. I mean, I think most of his stuff is quite long. So if you want to just get a taste of his writing, this is a good place to start. Although obviously books like Flesh and All That Man Is are going to be more available and whatever, and maybe more worth your time. This is my first, I've read excerpts from different things, but this is my first book of David Szalay's, and now I'm going to read everything of his. He's just an astounding writer, and his understanding of the way humans think about themselves and think about others, which is super vague, I know, but it's unique, which is a very rare thing in books, because there's a bajillion writers. Very rarely do you come across somebody who seems to work with the novel form in a new way, work with characters in a new way. And I don't know, there's just so much tension built inside, to use another cliche word, mundane moments. And a lot of this is focused on, is sort of like flashbacking, but being hooked in the present by a specific object, which is stuff that I really enjoy. I don't know, I want to read from the second story because I feel like there's just a ton of tension in this one. And I could totally read this whole thing. It's not very long, but I'm just going to read the first 2 or 3 pages. This is MAD to DSS, which I believe was Madrid to Dakar. That's right. I don't know how to pronounce this guy's name. Cheikh. Cheikh knew something was wrong when Muhammad wouldn't look him in the eye. "What is it, Muhammad?" he asked him. Muhammad said nothing. He had been waiting at arrivals with some other drivers. The terminal was quiet. It was late, after midnight. The flight from Madrid had been one of the few still to arrive. Muhammad took the suitcase without saying a word. As they stepped into the warm night, Czech told him about the turbulence that had hit his flight from London to Madrid, laughing as he described how he had spilled Coca-Cola all over himself and how he had tried to use a hand dryer in the men's room at Madrid airport to dry his trousers. Mohammed didn't seem to be listening. They stopped at the black Lexus, and he silently stowed the suitcase and then opened the door for his employer. "Oh, Mohammed," Czech said, sprawling in his creased suit across the leather seat. "I am so very tired." It was always an odd feeling to start the day in London or somewhere like that and end it here, in Dakar, at home. The hotel room overlooking the leafless park where he had woken that morning, where he had stood at the window and watched people in dark clothes hurry along the wet asphalt paths, some of them with umbrellas, seemed like something he had dreamed. It was strange to think that the same people would walk along the same paths tomorrow morning without him being there to see them. "The Bay of Biscay," he said, trying to find Mohammed's eye in the rearview mirror, "is notorious for turbulence. Did you know that, Mohammed?" Not meeting his eye, Mohammed just shook his head. "You didn't know that?" Czech waited for Mohammed to say something. He didn't. They had encountered traffic and were moving slowly. "You didn't know that?" Czech said again, and again Mohammed said nothing. The thing was, Mohammed was usually an encouraging and interested listener. This detached silence was strange. "What is it, Mohammed?" Czech said. The man pretended not to hear, and Czech wondered whether his wife had threatened to leave him again. Maybe he was embarrassed to talk about it. "Is it Mariama?" Czech asked, without delicacy. "No, sir," Mohammed said. "What then?" The traffic moved, and Mohammed, steering around a large pothole, used that as a pretext not to answer. People walked barefoot by the road. They emerged from the darkness into the dim, shadowy light under one of the street lamps. Then they disappeared into the darkness again. So it's sort of things like that. I don't know. I mean, I feel like I find a lot of really brief thoughts that feel extremely relatable, extremely applicable to the way like we think about things in motion. And maybe that's what he handles really well, is movement. You really feel like you're with the character as they're going through, I guess, the motions, but you're also really there in their mind because the way he portrays memories and these sort of flashbacks or, decision-making processes. It's just, this was a really fantastic book. And like I said, the quickest I ever read a book. I just couldn't put it down. Which is something that, as much as I read, it doesn't really happen that often. So definitely will be talking about him more soon. I don't know how, some of these extracurricular books, we'll call them, will fit into my school schedule, but that's sort of at the top of the list, is Flesh. So I would totally recommend that. And then I also want to talk about Zone Rouge by Jerome Plunkett, out September 2nd from Unnamed Press. This is super, super interesting. I think it is like historical fiction, but it is set in present day, and that's kind of what I feel is very unique about it. It takes place in Verdun, France, which I guess was kind of the barrier between Paris and Germany when the Germans were invading France. And so a lot of the battles took place in Verdun, and there were, over a period of 10 months, say, a number of shells and bombs and sort of things like that went off or didn't go off, but, could have at any moment if somebody stepped on them, or, or just dormant and whatever. Anyway, over a period of the last 100 years, World War I, so say, 1916 to now, there have been these, I don't know how you actually say it, it's like a French word, but demineers, like demining groups. So there's this group of people that their job is to basically pick up weapons. And so they basically, they go out in fields and they do it themselves. They field calls from people who are worried about, their property, whatever. And it's been 100 years of this, and it's going to be 100 more. Every year, this sort of government agency gives a new estimate, and every year it's just 100 years. It never goes down to 99, it never goes up to 101. It's just 100 more years every year. A super interesting topic. Jerome Plunkett was a veteran in the U.S. military, and he also does a lot, I think, for veterans right now. He hosts something called the Lit War podcast. He has book clubs for veterans. He's had people like Kaveh Akbar come out and speak to them. So I think it's some really cool stuff he's doing. I really love to learn more about him. And he really is a beautiful writer. The ending to this just absolutely blew me away. There were a few weak points as well, you know, sort of exposition being framed as dialogue, just some things that didn't make a lot of sense. But honestly, those felt like kind of glaringly obvious issues, and sometimes you just see those in proofs, especially when it's like a debut author and they're sort of rushing it, and a lot of revision takes place between when the uncorrected copy comes out and when the actual book comes out. So it's not something I would ever hold against it. I'm actually kind of excited to get the actual book and read that. We kind of follow Hugo, who's the sort of mayor of this town, this smaller town, and he's more of sort of a real estate mogul. He just sees it as an opportunity to rebuild the town and make it a vacation spot and, you know, build all these museums and whatever. And then also Martin, one of the demiurges, he gets a little sick and becomes more of a academic archaeologist, sort of the other side of things, where he's interacting with the history in a different way. And both their stories are incredibly interesting, and then you weave a ton of characters in and out. I would say there's no real main character, probably Martin. Hugo is not the most likable. He sort of reminds you of some people in power today. He's very arrogant. He sort of, actually there's this one point where he's trying to like have an affair with a woman and she rejects him, and he's like so astounded. He can't believe what's happening. He's like, I hadn't even prepared for the idea that I might be rejected. So he's the kind of person who sort of uses power to get what he wants. And while his story is very interesting, and I think there's a lot of empathy directed his way, he's also made fun of a bit, and yeah, he's not the most whatever. But Martin is sort of this beautifully constructed character. Like I said, it interacts with history in a wonderful way, and the perspective it takes on war is interesting. It's something I was thinking about sort of the whole time I was reading it, and then at the end, Martin kind of addresses this idea of like war lit, and how, like, you know, all these books kind of boil down to war bad, makes me sad. But, you know, look at us, we're still committing these atrocities. And so, yeah, there's even a beautiful passage where he's talking about how, like, nobody wants to be in car accidents, nobody wants to be in a plane crash. But as soon as war comes up, we rush at it like it's the greatest thing in the world. And so there's some of that. There's also, yeah, just really unique perspectives, because at one point, like, the sort of nameless 18-year-old boys who were serving in this war and died, never to be, you know, pulled from the ground, become like the narrator, and they're sort of narrating Martin's life, and that was like kind of mind-blowing. I do want to read a few passages from this. I was really pleasantly surprised by this book, and I thought it was, yeah, just really, really beautiful. It also sort of juxtaposes in some really interesting ways, not even just like the academic life, but the sort of naive life that's sort of lived indoors versus the people who are outside and really seeing the world, especially as we kind of lead into this sort of new age that seems to be appearing. That was a really, really interesting thing for me too. I guess this sort of short passage at the end, I feel like really hit the head on that. I honestly forget who was talking here, but this is the world we are interested in. The world of cracks and fissures where life manages to find root. Everything in between. Not necessarily the solid world itself. Who cares about that? It is so boring. Leave the world of the whole and the complete for those who can't bear to stare into the void for more than a few seconds. It's in those gaps and spaces and cracks and fissures where the truth resides. We are here to draw it out in the open. We want to pull that truth out into the light and make something more of it. Is it possible to make the truth truer? Outside of the calm, pastoral green fields with their quiet German forest that the mushroom pickers love to wander through, and their poisoned soil and infinite sadness, Verdun is a place of piles. Piles of munitions, piles of artifacts, piles of relics, piles of bones. Then this was a sort of longer passage I wanted to read, and this is when we're following Martin. Oh, man, I love some of these sections. They just moved so well, and the sort of interlinking of different narrators and different storylines and side characters. I just think it was done sort of beautifully and very carefully. And yeah, I'll read this part. In the steam-choked locker room of the depot that night, Martin sits on a bench, elbows resting on his thighs, and studies his hands. The calluses have a crimped look to them tonight. They have been reshaped yet again, another layer added, reformed by another 90 kg shell carried out of his own Rouge. The oppressive smell of male body odor, masked with deodorant and cologne, fills the room, and they fit together like 2 feet in one shoe. This will be his last day. There are no more moments like this one in his future. He received the news at the start of the shift, but kept it to himself and went about the day like normal. Normal. A word he knows will become foreign to him in the near future. This last day has been particularly long. He can't say why. Nothing unusual happened. Actually, it was an ordinary day. Ordinary in every sense of the word. Some days were like this, though. Long. Longer than the day before, heavier. Some days, Martin has looked out over the cratered landscape and counted the endless trees that stretch in every direction and thought, what the hell is the point? 100 years. That is the number they give on the annual reports. Every year, after all the numbers from all the districts involved in the cleanups have been calculated and compared to the numbers from the previous years, the head office, headquartered in Paris, publishes an updated projection on the progress of the operation, and every year the number stays at 100. Another century of cleansing before the countryside can be renewed. A lifetime and then some. 100 years, a century, at least, at most, who knows? Barbeau sings in the shower. A warbling, out-of-tune melody that Martin cannot identify. The sound echoes off the tiles. 100 years. The steam makes it difficult to breathe. Martin leans his head back and looks up at the ceiling. He draws a deep breath. The echoes from the shower bounce around in his mind. Even the streets of Verdun, how many years since it ended, and still always so quiet. Like the lobby of a funeral home. A certain weariness overtakes Martin every now and again, something deeper than exhaustion, something that sleep cannot solve, something that isn't just a matter of needing a break or a vacation. That something is the recognition that there is a very good chance this job will never be finished. 100 years. And after that, even if they somehow manage to pull out every splinter of shrapnel out of the ground, the chemical leach will last centuries. It's the echoes in the trees between the moss-covered craters and the way the trees begin to look like broken teeth in a gaping wide smile, a smile for a joke that he is only beginning to realize is on him. I'm going to skip ahead a few passages. On nights like this, he always takes the long way home and stops off for an espresso by himself at a cafe where they know him by name. A local spot with tile floors and tables along plate glass windows. It's tucked away in one of the thin, twisty back streets in the city's oldest quarter. Outside the dust-coated cafe windows, Verdun turns without pause as the clouds thicken with the threat of snow. The wind picks up and little bits of trash swirl about in the doorway of the small cafe, bouncing off the windows like grains of sand. Most people wouldn't even be able to tell you there is a cafe in the street. It is so rarely visited. Those who know about it couldn't tell you how they know about it. It isn't a place people discover. It's either known or forever overlooked. Man, that last passage, it's just something about the sort of, it's something that feels so true to life, maybe tying back to the very first passage I read, just about the aloneness of it and people who are sort of comfortable with that and people who aren't. And I think that point is actually made at one point. Now that I'm saying that, I feel like I'm totally just stealing that. I felt clever for a second, sorry. He actually says that at one point where like Hugo is looking at two people, Martin and then this other woman, who are both very, very good at their job, and he sort of boils down to the reason they're able to be so invested in something that is good and true and hard is because they're comfortable with being by themselves. And that just sort of sums up the book for me. It was just sort of this eye-opening experience in a lot of ways. I really, really, really enjoyed this. I didn't quite know what to expect, but it sounded so interesting that I was like, I'm going to have to read this. And it's something I would totally recommend. I really love seeing sort of people with unique stories writing unique books. And I really feel like that's what this is. Again, this is out from Unnamed Press on September 2nd. Zone Rouge by Jerome and Plunkett. Thank you all for watching. Again, I just love Turbulence. I know I talked about O'Connor and Maupassant at the beginning of this video. This was all around great video. All the books were great. All the stories were great. I was really happy to have been able to read all this. And thank you all for watching so much. I hope this wasn't too long. I'll have a sort of part 2 of August Reads video soon, as well as kind of everything I'm going to read this semester, and maybe some novel progress stuff, because I've really been doing a lot of work lately. Maybe I'll get some of that up on the Substack as well. Thank you all for sticking with me always, and always watching these videos. It really means the world. Thank you for commenting, reaching out, and please let me know if you've read any of these authors or have any recommendations for me. I truly, truly appreciate it. Hope you're having a great week, and I'll see you so soon.